Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, at the time of this taping, it is March, excuse me, 22nd, 2021, which means in the space of about 3 months, the Capitol has been ransacked by domestic terrorists. There was two snowstorms that hit the state of Texas, one of which sent temperatures down to 0 degrees in my hometown of Tyler, and the last time that has happened was the year 1899. And am I missing anything out? Oh, I got my first of my two COVID-19 vaccination shots, so that means I might have a social life sometime in the future. Yeah, right. Anyway, the point is that it's been a hectic couple of months, and it may not seem apparent, usually because I have a lot of videos kind of like scheduled out, but I honestly haven't sat down and done one of these videos in a while because I've been working on my painting a lot, I've been working on my drawing a lot, I've kind of been dealing with life in general, kind of, like we all are. So, taking the time to find 30 minutes or more to sit down and talk about a comic book, unfortunately, has fallen to the back burner. But I am dedicated, as always, to make sure that these videos are coming out. And I'm really excited today because we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite creators, Junji Ito. Now, before you say anything, we're not actually going to be talking about this book, Fragments of Horror. I have every intention of doing it sometime in the future, but we're going to be doing something a little different today, because rather than do one of the big books, like, say, Uzumaki, or Tomie, or even, Gyo, we're going to instead approach a book that the first time I read it, I honestly didn't think that I was going to cover it for this channel. It just seemed really weird and strange and different, even for a Junji Ito book. The book in question is Remina. Now, if you are a fan of Junji Ito, you've probably heard about this book. It came out about last year, kind of like right as the pandemic was hitting, which was kind of nice because I was able to go to my local comic book shop, Ground Zero Comics, and pick up a copy before I had to, lock myself away indefinitely. Nevertheless, Remina was kind of weird the first time I read it, and I was like, Junji Ito wrote this? Really? This is the guy who put, like, robot legs on fish coming out of the ocean, and a young girl who wants to be ripped apart by each one of her lovers, or a town beset by spirals, or maybe just a really bad Tool album. I don't know. The point is that this is a Junji Ito book? Really? Okay, well, I read it. I didn't really like it that much. And then I talked with a friend about it, gave it another reconsideration, sat down and read it again, and now I feel like it's a great starting point to talk about Junji Ito on this channel. And, as you can see, clearly, I kind of have a penchant, or I kind of have a passion for the man's work, so I guarantee you we're going to get to all of these, and maybe even some of the, odder works in the man's oeuvre. But whatever the case, I wanted to cover Remina because this is, in my opinion, a really good starting point for people who may be interested in Junji Ito. And it was also just a really interesting opportunity to sit down and talk about a horror comic, which I don't believe I've really done up to this point. So the opportunity to talk about the horror aesthetic while also talking about one of my favorite cartoonists of all time, just as you can see, I'm getting excited. I need to focus. So, as always, let's go into now what exactly is Remina about, and narratively speaking, and why I think it's important. Alright, so now that I've kind of gabbed like I usually do about these books, let's sit down and talk about, narratively speaking, what is Remina actually about. Now, it's important to recognize right off the bat, you may note that the way that I'll be approaching this book is a tad different than normal. I'm not starting off and reading from left to right. That's because, again, this is a manga. This is an Asian-style comic. You read from right to left. And that can confuse some people if they've never read a manga before. So, I highly encourage you, you may not necessarily want, if you've never read a manga before, this may not be the best place to start. You may want to pick another book. I recommend this lovely series here, The Girl from the Other Side. It's a nice, sweet little story. Well, sweet little story. But nevertheless, it's very approachable in terms of its construction, whereas Junji Ito's work can sometimes get a tad complex visually, and the dialogue can be confusing. Nevertheless, if you've never read a Junji Ito work before, it's important to recognize that Junji Ito is a cartoonist, a manga artist specifically, and again, that means he's primarily going to be producing his work from Japan. Now, fun fact, Remina had actually been published in Japan several years ago, but kind of at the start of Junji Ito's career. I'm afraid I didn't take the time to sit down and find an actual quote, so if somebody knows the specific date of when the original manga came out, please leave it in the comment section below, and I'll try to make sure to maybe do an update for this video or a coda or something like that. Or maybe I'll just review it again, who knows. Whatever the case, this work had actually existed for some time, but it was really after the success of books like Uzumaki and Tomie, once Junji Ito's sort of career really began to sort of launch off, not only in Japan, but here in the United States as well, people began to take more notice of him, and slowly but surely we're seeing more and more of his work getting translated. Remina is just such a recent translation. This book is also really interesting, too, because it's arguably the most bizarre in terms of its content when we talk about Junji Ito. For the most part, Junji Ito is a horror writer. He focuses a lot on the body, but also manages to dig into things like spirits and the way that they can manipulate the human form. He talks about psychosis a lot and the way it can compel people towards really just malicious actions. And sometimes he can even touch on aspects of the sublime. But one of the things I've never seen Junji Ito do is tackle something, say, like a giant planet that's alive that, has, say, a giant tongue that licks the moon into non-existence. Huh. Alright. But for real, that's exactly what the story is about. The narrative focus of Remina is primarily first upon a scientist by the name of Dr. Oguro, who discovers Remina, or really just this odd planet which he believes is just sort of transported through a wormhole or a black hole. He observes that it's approaching Earth at a really quick rate. This is a phenomenal discovery in terms of the field of astronomy, and so, because he is the person to discover this planet, he names it after his lovely young daughter, Remina, who, it is noted, is very attractive and beautiful, and very quickly as well becomes a figure of kind of like pop culture celebrity. Millions of people become obsessed with Remina, and it's important to note, at the very beginning of the story, Dr. Oguro is being interviewed, and they're wanting to know, why did you name it after your daughter? And he was like, well, it's a beautiful planet, I wanted to name it after her. It becomes apparent very quickly, however, that Remina did not want to be named after this planet. She didn't want any connection to it whatsoever. And this is really easy to miss, because on one hand, this may just be a teenager feeling embarrassed by her dad, trying to bring attention to her. But then, again, as we observe later on in the story, as Remina becomes closer and closer to the planet, there is an important significance in the fact that people begin to wonder what is bringing Remina to the planet. Now, I'll hold up this page in particular so that you can pause it and read it for a moment. So go ahead and pause. All right, you paused? Okay, you're back. Okay, so you clearly recognized and read in that passage right off the bat that what's taking place is that as the planet is approaching the Earth and as more and more planets are being effectively devoured or destroyed by this planet, Remina, people are beginning to recognize, oh, shoot, this thing is coming to Earth. It's going to destroy us. And because it bears the name Remina, people logically began to associate the cause of their ultimate destruction with Remina, the young woman. After that, the story basically just follows the pursuit of Remina as she is being hounded by an evil, desperate group of human beings who don't know how to handle their coming mortality. The story follows Remina as she continues to attempt to escape, but far more often than not is captured by a ruthless group of thugs after thugs after thugs and steadily tortured throughout the remainder of the text. And while this is taking place, Junji Ito is also bringing in a lot of kind of cosmological horror and really emphasizing that what is happening here is unprecedented. I showed this panel here earlier before because, one, I wanted just the shock factor, but then also, two, we recognize that what's taking place is not fundamentally realistic. I was speaking with a friend of mine, and he was talking about how he loved this book at first, narratively, and he still does, because he was able to forego his suspension of disbelief, or willing suspension of disbelief. That's a literary term. There's dozens of instances in this book that are absurd and ridiculous, and any planetary physicist will look at this and be like, huh? The point is not necessarily to focus on the minor details like this. Junji Ito is trying to capture, really more than anything else, a perception of helplessness that Remina herself feels as not only this inescapable force has come upon her planet and threatens her existence, but then literally all of humanity becomes dedicated to the idea that she is the one that causes this planet to ultimately come and destroy everyone. Now, this can kind of, at times, border on the ridiculous. In one particular passage, a homeless man who has become sort of blamed or sort of connected to Remina liberates her from the sort of crazed people that are chasing her and want to torture her and kill her. And you'll note at one point he falls into this great canyon, which then sort of propels him through the air. What's happened is when the giant tongue licked the surface of the planet Earth, it created this huge cavern, which is now basically a wind tunnel. And we get literally page after page after page of Remina and this man basically just flying through the sky, being hounded by other people flying through the sky. One of the things about Junji Ito, and I do intend to talk about this in other stories as well, is that sometimes he can kind of push things. And this is something that's very present in the genre of horror in general, is it's a very delicate balance. If you push things too far, it stops being scary and it becomes funny and ridiculous and absurd. It's one of the reasons why, to this day, slasher films teeter on a very precarious balance between falling into just plain body horror and then just being so stupid and ridiculous and absurd that it becomes pure comedy gold. This can sometimes happen with Remina, and as much as I was disturbed by the actions in this book sometimes, you get moments where you suddenly see just groups of mad people flying through the air chasing after a teenage girl, and you're like, y'all, what are you doing? Yeah. What's important here is that ultimately, Remina does manage to escape from these hordes of people that are constantly trying to destroy her. In one particular scene, we observe this figure in black robes who has sort of hounded her and chased her and continually led the mob against her, to which, spoiler alert, at one point, the top of his robes are removed. Now, if you've read the story up to this point, and I'm assuming here that you have, if you haven't, stop the video and just go read the book and then come back. You gone? Okay. Oh my God, like, why can they not buy decent pants? Like, oh God, you're still here. Anyway, what's important here is the figure in question becomes Yugoda, the former president of Remina's fan club. And so what we kind of observe here is a kind of a multi-part narrative commentary. Over and over and over again, Remina is really a story about helplessness, particularly about the helplessness of this young woman, Remina, who is thrust into a horrible position again and again and again due to the selfishness and the fear of the people around her. And so, ultimately, in the very end, Remina is... I gotta make sure I mark my spot. In the very end, Remina manages to, through a kind of deus ex machina, but ultimately get herself liberated from the planet Earth and from the planet Remina in a kind of, I guess what you could say, escape pod in the basement of this really rich family that we had seen earlier. Honestly, it's kind of, like I said, it's kind of a deus ex machina, but it does kind of resolve the pain and suffering that Remina experiences throughout the whole story. if we look at just the narrative focus of this, it would be easy to kind of, at first glance, argue that this is a science fiction work. But I'm going to come out on a limb here and really stand firm on the position that this is not a work of science fiction. A friend of mine who works at the same library as me was speaking to me one day about a book he had read that was in the science fiction section, but he argued it really wasn't science fiction. The reason for this, he argued, was that science fiction as a genre is really about exploring a kind of scientific concept or precept or just general notion, and that all of the fiction is going to be sort of an exploration of that scientific concept. The science has to be there. In the story of Remina, there really isn't any hard science, or if there is, Junji Ito isn't particularly preoccupied with it. And honestly and truthfully, neither should we be. The focus of the story is not just how exactly would a gigantic living organism be able to lick the moon into obliteration. No, we're not going to get into it. There's occasional spots where things seem to be researched, but what's important here more than anything else is the horrific elements of it. What's at play in this book, and I'll talk about this a lot more when I eventually review Uzumaki, is that we're exploring a universe where human life is not valued. And that's ultimately one of the key definitions of the horror genre, is that characters begin to encounter a reality where human life is not just unimportant, but not necessary. And in that vacuum of importance and significance, human beings often fall upon their baser instincts and at times can engage in sadism, can engage in what most of us would consider evil actions. And so the horror becomes watching this figure encountering these people, encountering these situations, and asking ourselves the question, why are we not valuing the life of this young woman? Why are we not valuing just her right as a human being to exist? To which case the response is, we just don't, because we're afraid. Food for thought. All right, now that we know what Remina is about, narratively speaking, let's get into the kind of formalistic aspects of Remina and why I think that as a comic, Junji Ito is just chef's kiss. Great, wonderful, let's get into it. Okay, so now we know what the story of Remina is about. It's about a giant planet that tries to eat everything. Poor young woman gets tortured by the hordes of humanity that blame her for everything, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So, that's it. So, formally then, why exactly do I think, or why exactly am I taking the time and effort to talk to you about why Remina matters, when you have books like, again, Tomie and Uzumaki and Gyo literally to my left, just sitting there mocking me and reminding me that I'm reviewing Remina instead of them. Well, again, at first I was not impressed by this book, and it had far more to do with the narrative focus. But one thing that I would not take away from this book is, again, this right here. One of the most important things to me about this book is that it's by Junji Ito, and Junji Ito is, above all things else, an incredible cartoonist. He knows and understands the medium, and specifically how to use the elements of the medium to his advantage. One of the most interesting and beautiful aspects to me is Junji Ito's line work, and sometimes it can get lost in pages like this, where all we seem to have are a bunch of talking heads. But again, if you pay attention to little details, take a look at this man who basically comes up with the idea that Remina is the one to blame. You'll note the attention paid to the sweat drops, the shadowing effect on top of his hair to kind of create a dramatic episode. The shadowing is really important here in creating this character and sort of pushing him into the realms of darkness, which we're going to explore. And then, of course, by the end of it, you'll observe what I can only describe as, I guess, Junji Ito eyeliner. Like, that's the only way I can really describe it, because it's a technique he employs regularly, and any seasoned reader of Junji Ito recognizes it. The shadowing effect around the eyes creates a kind of dramatic presentation that the reader begins to recognize. It becomes a kind of language unto itself. As soon as the reader sees the shadowing around a character's eyes, we immediately understand, oh, this person is messed up. Like a lot. By the way, if you hear clicking, my sweet little puppy dog Sonia's kind of pacing the room because I'm not sitting in the living room with her, and it's kind of annoying her. Say hello to the internet, Sonia. She's shy. Anyway, when we're talking about Junji Ito, again, it's important to recognize how important and how great he is as a visual artist. And if I can point again towards just this three-panel structure here, we can observe how, as the scientists are beginning to recognize more and more the approach of the planet Remina, there's more and more of an adjustment of the size of the panels. You'll see here, Remina just seems like a distant object, and then we get a little more focus, and you'll note he's increased the size of the panel so that by the time we get to the last one and we're beginning to recognize that, oh, Remina's coming closer and closer to us, and this potentially means a threat to the world at large, he's given it a larger frame. Again, Junji Ito is paying attention to the way that the arrangement of the panels on the page can really influence the sort of emotional, intellectual, and aesthetic effect it will have upon the reader. Now, if we take another instance, and forewarning, trigger warning, we're talking about a horror graphic novel here, so things are going to get violent. So, in one particular passage, Remina has been captured by the mob that's being led by Oroguro. We know the president of her fan club. Well, we don't know at the time, but we eventually find out. She leads her to a sort of a large communal square where we discover the mob has captured her father and has strung him up on a cross. Now, this is really important. I am not aware of Junji Ito's religious affiliations, assuming he has any at all. It's important to recognize that when we look at the cross in this instance, it could very well be that Junji Ito is employing it as a kind of like reference to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. At the same time, anybody who has done any research about the history of the Roman Empire knows that crucifixion was actually a pretty common method of punishment, and that literally millions of people had been crucified by the Roman Empire before Jesus. A cross, while being today a symbol for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, is still, and it's in terms of its history and its past and its origin, a symbol or really just a tool of torture. And so when we're focusing on this review, I'm going to be focusing on that aspect rather than any religious imagery. Again, I'm an atheist, so religious imagery it doesn't leave anything for me. But what's important here about it as well is the notion of the way that they're trying to turn, or the way the mob is effectively creating a scapegoat out of the doctor and then ultimately out of Remina himself. We don't get just the crucifixion by itself, which would be just nailing him to the cross or leaving him up there to eventually suffocate, which is actually what happens during the process of crucifixion. Instead, we see them basically just stabbing him again and again in front of Remina. It's heavy and messed up, and I will admit that even though I wasn't always enjoying the book the first time, even I had to stop and be like, oh my gosh. And the thing is, there again, if we look, the story doesn't necessarily stop there. One of the hardest parts about the book Remina is watching the journey of Remina, because far more often than not, it is really more just watching the sadism of the mob upon her. Again, we're looking at human beings that have been pushed to the realm of pure desperation. They perceive a real, fundamental, existential just threat to their existence, and in that fear, they have to find some kind of justification for the end of their lives. Again, in terms of the horror genre, there is no justification. Suffering sometimes tends to happen simply for its own sake. And so, one of the hard parts about the genre, formally speaking, is that it can leave you with a real sense of injustice. But in terms of storytelling, it can be a really good way of addressing injustice. One of the continual, and again, trigger warning, this can get rough. One of the hardest parts of this book, over and over again, is watching Remina just steadily being tortured and harassed and just devastated by these people who are at their wits' end and being pushed into arguably the most corrosive and toxic choices of their life. And I will admit, one of the problems I had with it is that oftentimes Junji Ito just extends these torture sequences page after page after page, on the one hand, I recognize it as a rhetorical effort. It's an effort to try to understand why human beings do horrible things. And the reason is, again, fear. These people are afraid about dying. Makes sense. Just about everybody's afraid of dying in some form or capacity. And what's interesting in terms of a horror genre perspective is these torture sequences on the part of the human beings that recognize that this is the end of their lives, it becomes a way to explore through the medium of comics that feeling of injustice, the idea that life is supposed to mean something. So what happens when these events come along that strip us of that meaning? And in terms of the medium itself, you'll note one of the things that Junji Ito does really well, despite my own discomfort, is he manages to use the visual language of comics that we talked a lot about when I did my review of Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. You'll see these hard, dramatic lines that literally slice through Remina, indicating we can almost just kind of feel, well, we can just feel the whip striking her flesh. We can physically feel it. And that's entirely due to the size of the panel, the way it spills off the end of this page, the way he uses these onomatopoeias, these big, dramatic, bold texts, and then again, just these little visual cues so that the reader picks up on the actual sound and feel of that whip just slicing through the air. And again, I'm not denying that there aren't parts of this story that can seem just ridiculously gargantuan. In one particular sequence of pages, we observe the planet Remina just licking the surface of the Earth. And on the one hand, it can seem ridiculous, but one of the great things about Ito is he plays his cards, and I think he wins. Because watching these sequences of just this giant planet-destroying planet, one is kind of struck by the sheer sort of sublime power of this force. Now, if you don't know what sublime is an idea, or really a concept that was developed during the Romantic era of poetry. So you're talking 1700s to early 1800s. Think guys like George Gordon, Lord Byron, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, what have you. The sublime was a kind of perception of the natural world around you that filled you with terror and awe at the same time. So one familiar form of a sublime sensation is watching a hurricane or a tornado. It can leave you with a sublime feeling or a sublime perception because at that moment you're observing the natural world, you're recognizing the power that it has and kind of your own powerlessness in relation to it, but at the same time you're left just in absolute awe. And I think Junji Ito manages to accomplish this a lot throughout this book. I don't have a lot more else to say because, again, I've kind of already addressed it. One of the things I like about Junji Ito, not just in terms of this book, but all of his books, is he knows the importance of how to arrange panels on the page so that they begin to assume a kind of dramatic significance. Again, if we look at this page here when the crazed lot of humanity are chasing Remina and the homeless man, whose name, of course, I can't remember, we get just this nice panel page here. I mean, technically we've got this as well, which is really nice. You've got all these figures flying while the planet stares on. But if we look at just these two pages, or these two panels here, again, he's trying to really heighten the helplessness of Remina and just the endless pursuit that these human beings that are losing all aspect of their humanity, the way that they're chasing her and pursuing her endlessly to destroy her. It leaves you kind of with just this heightened sense of awe of just the possibility of the behavior of humanity. And I can keep going and show you page after page after page, but formally speaking, Remina really demonstrates how comics can work really well and how Junji Ito is really successful, in my opinion, as a cartoonist in using the arrangement of panels, in using the medium of comics to convey these notions of helplessness, pain, torture, sadism. It all works because Junji Ito knows how to use visual cues and, again, panel layouts to really get you pumped. Okay, said all that, let's do the last hurrah and then call it a day. So, yeah, Remina. When we're talking about this book, we're talking about a horror manga created by arguably one of the most important, not necessarily just horror manga artists, but just important artists in terms of our recent memory. Junji Ito is a fierce talent. Just about everything he does, you can see the passion and the dedication he puts into every single one of these stories. Remina, for me, is not necessarily at the same level of later works that or earlier works that I read, like Uzumaki, Tomie, and Gyo. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to be. Remina may not be the best work that Junji Ito has ever done, but it's still a really good way to sort of introduce people to Junji Ito, I think, because it shows you what is possible through the medium, and then also the kind of narrative themes that the man himself is often interested in possessing. Junji Ito likes his world gritty and nasty, and oftentimes leaves people hopeless or downright insane. And yet, nevertheless, he still manages to create art in just about everything he does because everything is centered on how humanity can create its sense of self, how humanity can ultimately destroy itself, and then ultimately one of the best aspects of the horror genre, which is again to ask the question of what happens when human life, that thing which is supposed to mean so much, can suddenly mean nothing at all. Formally speaking, Remina is wonderful. And while I don't think it necessarily reaches the heights of some of the books that I keep pointing at over and over and over again, it still manages to hold its own as an important comic and can be a great source of inspiration for cartoonists and artists anywhere who want to try to approach not just this medium, but even just the genre of horror itself. If you love horror, if you love comics, Junji Ito has to be read, and Remina is a wonderful book to get started on. So, can't recommend it enough. Yeah, I think I'm going to end it there. Huge shout out to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. I know sometimes watching me for a whole half hour can be a drag, but, you know, at least I'm cute. At least I'm funny. You got something to do for half an hour. Anyway, also wanted to say shout out again. Thank you to Ground Zero Comics as always. My friend Michael, who just loves Junji Ito even more than I do somehow, is the one who told me when this book was coming out. He's the one who managed to pull a copy aside for me. So thank you guys. Thank you, Ground Zero. You guys are awesome. Just a reminder as well, I have begun Patreon, not just for this YouTube channel, but also to help me pay for my art, which you can find at the link tree, which should be available in the About section, though honestly I think I'm just posting it in the description section all the time anyway, so feel free to check it out there. If you have even just $1 a month that you don't mind parting with, that's all I'm asking for. I don't ask for anything higher than that. It's just helping me buy markers and paints, and if you want to give me $1, thank you. I appreciate it. In terms of Remina, as always, you can probably find this at your local comic book shop. Again, it's a manga, and more comic book shops in the United States are beginning to recognize just the sales potential of manga and just how dedicated manga fans can be. So, try your local comic book shop. They might have a copy of it. If not, they may be able to order it for you. If you can't find one there, don't forget, you live in a world with public libraries, and I guarantee you most libraries these days are trying to expand their collections and try to build a comic collection. Check your library, see if they've got Remina. If not, ask them for an interlibrary loan form and they can get it for you. And again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.